Good morning, everyone. Hello there. We might make a start, if that's all right. I think there may be still a number of people still to come. But good morning to you. My name's Bronwyn Clarkson. I'm a partner at Carnegie Lawyers. We proudly do a lot of work with the ARQ and with your scheme. I practice in the area of commercial property. I've been practicing for over 20 years now. And I've been asked to present to you today to contribute to your commercial professional development program. And I've selected some topics that have come through from feedback from your membership as to what you're interested to hear about. So I hope those topics are of interest, and I'm happy to use today to explore those and take questions from you as you might find useful. So I'm perfectly happy, provided we keep getting through things, to take questions along the way. And so please feel free to shout out or throw your hand up. And we'll just try and work through things, and I'll be guided by you to the degree of delving into any of these particular topics that we might do. So without further ado, moving on. So today, the topics I want to cover are firstly, looking at the completion of the commercial contracts. This was something that was highlighted that's coming through as a feedback item that membership wanted to hear about and explore. So we'll step through that. I trust that in your materials I've asked for a printout just to be available of the commercial land contract, but we'll also just have a look at a couple of the items in the commercial unit contract as well. The commercial building disclosure requirements, there are some changes coming through to this, and there are important pre-contractual disclosure requirements around this, so it probably never hurts just to quickly touch on that. We've got some Retail Shop Leases Act changes about to come through. We've been deferred commencement, they'll start at the end of this month. And then just thought we'd have a little bit of a look at term sheets and use of heads of agreement in pre-contract negotiations for leasing and sale transactions. So obviously we're talking about with these commercial contracts, just making sure we've got the right edition in front of us, that we're looking at the 5th edition in relation to the land contract, and the 4th edition. You're probably well aware, and I do recall coming and chatting to the membership about the updated editions, or just in advance of those, which were really triggered primarily by the taxation, foreign capital gains tax withholding issues, and some provisions that have been put into the standard conditions to deal with those. So particularly the sales over 2 million, it's very important that these current editions are in use as they deal with that. But there were some other tie-ups and changes related to electronic conveyancing as well. So looking specifically at the commercial land contract first, and recognising that this is, it's a very, very much used contract across, a wide variety of types of property. It really is for legal practitioners as much as your membership. The standard starting point just about for any transaction of non-residential property. So that can cover industrial, commercial, leased, developed, vacant, urban, in some cases rural. It's really not ideal for rural transactions, but it'll sit over the top of a lot of different sets of special conditions. So it can't necessarily be all things to all people. It is an excellent platform as a starting point for just about any non-residential transaction, and so it's been in use thoroughly. It has obviously been through a number of additions and refinements, so it's a pretty well understood contract in the legal profession, and no doubt in your membership as well, and across participants in the commercial property sector. Just making that point there about using the correct edition again, as I say. My experience is that it is quite rarely used without special conditions. Most well-advised parties will often try and push back in some areas around the standard conditions, but you know, that's not always the case, and like I say, it's a sound platform to go forward with any transaction, but it does need to be, you know, that there are certainly various switches in the standard conditions, some of which we'll have a look at today, that are commonly sought to be either excluded or modified by one party or the other. I think in the legal profession, I think the standard conditions unmodified are regarded as being somewhat buyer-friendly. There are quite a number of warranties and statements sprinkled through the standard conditions that give rise to rights of termination for buyers. And in a climate where parties are looking for certain transactions and certainty around that, and perhaps the increased prevalence of early upfront due diligence, broader due diligence inquiries where a vendor might open themselves up to those but then want to know that they've got a certain sale after that, does tend, usually for, I find well-advised parties will be generally arguing around, certainly a seller will look to exclude or modify a number of the standard conditions, and recognising that in many instances, you know, unless you're a buyer's agent, you know, you're there for the seller, then there'll be a number of instances where, you know, sellers really should think about excluding or modifying or really understanding what they're signing up to in terms of the standard conditions unmodified. And it is always a point of reference to understand that increasingly, really, the property industry generally is regulated by so many pieces of legislation, just a couple of which we're touching on today. But, you know, there are increasingly pre-contractual disclosure requirements, and, you know, these are traps for the unwary in terms of termination rights and so on. It's pretty well understood the contamination and environmental management register, pre-contract disclosure, but there are others as well, so including, you know, Building Energy Disclosure Act, so efficiency disclosure. So there are a number of these pre-contractual disclosures that do need to be thought of, and, you know, that's before the signature goes on the contract. So that's always something to be wary of, or to be referring your clients for advice on. So stepping through just the reference schedule items, and I do respect that, you know, a number of you who might operate almost exclusively in commercial may consider this very elementary, and I don't want to dwell unnecessarily on basic items, but for those who might dabble in commercial property or have it as only part of your practice, and the devil can sometimes be in the detail, and it's just worth quickly stepping through these items, and I'm very happy to, you know, hear from you if there are any particular aspects of the reference schedules that you find problematic in practice, in terms of either completing those or recommending them, or having a first draft of something that might go to a legal practitioner for review. And even as elementary as the contract date, you know, obviously this is quite a key date for quite a number of switches in the standard conditions in terms of timing, or it can be, depending on how other timeframes are expressed, such as finance, but commonly 14 days from contract date and this kind of thing. So you really, it's not the behest of any party to write the date into the contract. It is a matter of law as to when the contract is in fact formed, and that's when the contract has been duly exchanged. You've got meeting of the minds, you've got offer, acceptance, communication, and so if a party can't self-servingly write the date that suits them into the contract, it really must be the date of formation. If it's wrongly inserted, it's exigible to be amended. So don't ever think that it's the behest of one party or the other to just write in the date that suits them, or if they've signed it, they date it, send it off. You know, it's the date when the last party was signed, and that's just something to watch out for in terms of key dates that might come through. Now obviously there's a place there in item B for insertion of the agent's details. This doesn't amount to an effective appointment for the Property Occupations Act, but it never hurts to, there's a standard condition in there that links and confirms the appointment. So if you are the appointed agent, your details get in there. It's affirmatory. It's hopefully going to lead to less confusion if there's more than one agent involved, if there's an open listing, you know, who has been the source of introduction of the sale, and to have your details in there correctly never hurts if you've been the one to introduce the buyer. Yes, question?
In the past, I understood that if an agent was in the contract signed by both parties and settled, that was a recognition of the agent being the agent, or is that not the case now?
The standard condition that's in there refers to confirming that the question, was whether in the past that clause was sort of sufficient. So standard condition 30 is in there, and it says that in the absence of any specific appointment, the seller, by executing the contract, confirms the appointment of the seller's agent, and then alludes to joint appointments if the case, and as the agent of the seller to introduce a buyer. And so look, it to my mind doesn't override any other requirements under the Property Occupations Act for Form 6 and those sorts of things.
And I only ask this because occasionally, I guess we all have it, that something comes out, it's not for sale, and we sell it, and we don't have signed authority from the vendor, and the deal is done. Is that not assertable, having that name in the contract, the agent's name, and say we didn't get paid, we didn't hold the deposit, did get paid?
Whether that's, the question is whether that is sufficient of itself to override. Look, I just would want to double check the appointment of agent requirements. I understand that you need a Form 6, and that this would be affirmatory. So I might take that one on notice. I'm sorry, I should have thought about that more carefully, but I'm saying it's corroboratory at the very least, and is going to aid in you, evidencing yourself as being correctly appointed. Sorry, another question on the back there?
Well, more a statement actually, Bronwyn. My clear understanding is that unless you've got a separate authority to sell in writing that predates the contract, that clause makes no sense.
That's right. And, I think that's right. The statement from the member there is that you need the proper appointment. And look, that's what I understood under the Property Occupations Act to be the case. So I don't believe you should be relying on that, but I don't think it hurts as a corroboratory, confirmatory element. If there could be arguments about whether an open appointment's been revoked or something or other, that these sorts of things, it never hurts, and that really you should, it shouldn't override. It's not going to override your statutory obligations to have authorised appointments under the Property Occupations Act. Even just down to the parties, so a seller and buyer, their address is helpful to have that very correct, because there are enabling provisions regarding notices to them. So being able to give effective, timely notices to other parties, having their details correct. Obviously, in commercial contracts, there's usually going to be GST involvement. It's helpful to bring forward the ABN of the party early on and get that in the contract. There's obviously spaces there for that to go in. In the case of trusts, the ACN of the company is just going to identify you as the trustee of the trust. The trust will have its own ABN that is not an ACN-based ABN. So that can come forward, and to make sure that you're dealing with the correct entity, and obviously marrying with naturally the registered owner of the land. In the case of buyers, do avoid any references to order nominee. That's not effective, and it can create duty problems for buyers. They cannot effectively have an order nominee contract without incurring double duty unless there are other arrangements in place. So if the buyer is uncertain about what entity they want to use, then potentially a put and call option is a mechanism to deal with rights of nomination or bringing forward a different entity after the parties want to conclude their deal. Now that does require documentation over the top of the contract, and it defers entry into the contract, but the or nominee expressions, absolutely not suitable. And similarly, just addresses for buyer solicitors and addresses, again, it's just an enabling thing regarding notices, timely and effective notices, because the notices provision in the standard conditions gives the right for the other party to send emails, faxes, etc. to give timely notices. So that's helpful to have right. They can always be changed if different people engage down the track. So item G is the deposit holder. This is rarely controversial, but it's just to understand the role of the deposit holder. May be required to invest the deposit. Could get stuck in the middle somewhat of a dispute. Whether it's obviously usually the lawyer for one of the other parties, or indeed one, your membership, your own, the selling agent may hold the deposit. Just to understand, there are some responsibilities that go with that role. If there are complex provisions that are inserted by way of special conditions around potential non-refundability of deposits, or drawdowns of deposits, or any instance, what you look for if you're the deposit holder is that there are very clear instructions and authorisations and directions, so that the deposit holder is very clear about what they need to do, and that don't get caught ideally in the middle of a dispute about the deposit where you are unclear whether instructions are there or authorisations are there. Then we come to items H, I and J. So these are essentially what comprise the property under the contract, and precision here is essential. Obviously we've got lot of plan descriptions, title references. Addresses are not of themselves, the legal description of the land. They are more for convenience purposes, and we would all have had instances where addresses can differ, or properties have got dual frontages, or they might have run from a number of numbers on a particular street or so. So just to understand that precision, if there's a part of a lot involved in a circumstance where parties are permitted to go straight to contract under a small subdivision now, with the Land Sales Act having been amended, it's just very important to be precise, ensure that a plan is annexed to describe the part of a lot that's going. Improvements and other chattels. So there's a deeming provision to include improvements that go with the land fixtures, but these can be reserved. The item is there for that purpose, and these should all be thought about as to what does the buyer want to take with them. Do they want to dismantle a shed, or is there anything that they want to take with them that might potentially be regarded as a fixture that could otherwise cause them grief at the back end of the contract. Chattels, primarily not included. They're not part of the freehold land, or they're not going to be deemed included unless expressly added. So this is an opportunity to either offload any materials that are there that are intended to be included. But once again, just encourage precision with those particular items. And noting that in relation to item H, there's just making sure I'm correct with the item, around being state leasehold or freehold. So this contract does contemplate the type of holding, and whether it's freehold or leasehold, and that should be understood, and that can raise some queries about applicability to the standard conditions. The standard conditions do accommodate state leasehold land, but they'll commonly have to be looked at carefully in terms of any other modifications by the special conditions for ministerial consents and the like. Sorry, I've just realised it's item K. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead there. It's in terms of that item. So item L around encumbrances. So this is a very important aspect of the contract. The property is deemed to be sold free from encumbrances other than those identified here. And this has been modified over time. In previous editions, and there was a practice of it sort of being somewhat batted back to the buyer by way of saying, search will reveal, or see title search, or something attempting to be somewhat non-committal there around encumbrances. But so if there's any encumbrance on the property other than one that's identified here, that will give rise to rights for the buyer, either by warranties or avoiding the balance of the contract, to terminate the contract. So what is a bit tricky about this, I find, is that naturally we all look at a title search and there's often obviously an easement or they're obviously the most common enduring encumbrance that might remain on land, whether a registered lease otherwise, for leased property. But the definition of encumbrances in the standard conditions is really quite broader than that. And this is, it's a bit of a conundrum as to exactly how to overcome that. It's, the definition is broader, so it includes unregistered encumbrances, statutory encumbrances, and security interests. So it includes but is not limited to. So to my mind, that's really hard, for a seller to have at their fingertips every imaginable statutory encumbrance that might affect their property, and it's just a bit tricky. I think clearly, practice seems to be that really what's identified are your title search type encumbrances. I do see, some practitioners saying, subject to the deed of grant, and citing that on the basis that recognises there are a cluster of sort of reservations of title whenever any grant is made, and that's sort of the government authority that comes through enactments that create encumbrances. But it's just an item that really does require care, and I'm not sure that there's any sort of magic solution based on just the description of encumbrances there. And it's tricky to try and negotiate amendments to that too, because not many buyers are going to want to say, yeah, I'll take subject to whatever statutory encumbrances. You don't know what they are, but I'm fine with that. So it's just a tricky one to negotiate, and it's just something to be aware of.
Quite often we get some properties with power lines, but they're not registered. So what would you recommend?
Well, look, I would think, because those are the sorts of potential statutory easements. So the query is sometimes we might get properties with power lines, but not subject to an easement on title, not a registered title. So the utility providers will have some statutory authorities and rights of access. Look, it would never hurt to kind of declare anything in there in terms of power link or urban power lines or whatever it might be. Obviously if they're visually apparent, there's an element of buyer understanding there. But I think, look, the name of the game is disclose, and again, special conditions can aid in that to say that, they're satisfied about that aspect of the property and, that overrides the standard condition, that sort of thing. But look, the utility providers do have various statutory rights of access for essential services. So that's, the kind of thing you're talking about, and where they're not as visually obvious might be difficult, and even underground services as well.
The same as like sewer as well.
I beg your pardon?
It's the same with the sewer line running through the property.
Yes, quite, sewer lines, and that's right, yes, that might run underneath, and they won't always be the subject of specific easements. And I know, I've got a property I'm looking at the moment in that very situation where the council search has come back and shown that there was no registered easement. So, look, I haven't seen it litigated in my practice, but it's just something I draw your attention to the care. So item M, obviously in the commercial sector, we're generally going to be selling developed, or many instances going to be selling developed property, and those schedules are there. I just encourage again precision there, because what goes in there must be very precise, and it's not always completely obvious what the current rent is if we're well into a lease that's been subject to various rent reviews and so forth. It's not apparent from the lease on its face what the rent is, so the seller's going to have to be very careful about that. And these do unmodified, the standard conditions impose warranties around this information, and any key aspects that are incorrect will give rise to rights of termination. So that applies to both leases and service contracts. keep an eye out. You know, there's no need to refer to GST here, and you know, the standard conditions pick that up even without modification, obviously. Be alert, you know, the $2 million threshold around these, you know, seller clearance certificates now for the ATO, foreign capital gains tax withholding, that the, you know, the standard conditions do pick this up and you know, give the parties the right to go and get that certificate or deal with the payment of the relevant portion to the government, but just have to think about that. Deposits, the contract, you know, I think in response to what is such a common commercial phenomenon where you'll get some sort of holding deposit down and then a balance after some sort of key condition such as finance or inspection or, you know, under special conditions, due diligence, that sort of thing. So that, you know, this is now in the reference schedule. It makes it easier to step it out. Just always do the alert to the instalment contract aspect of things. That we don't want to trigger an instalment contract under the Property Law Act, which can create problems for the seller in terms of rights of termination. So they don't want to exceed generally 10% or 20% for off-plan sales if you're going to step it up. The Property Law Act section particularly picks up instalments. So where we've got a broken deposit, you've automatically got instalments, and then you just don't want to go over that threshold.
Just a question on that. With a, let's say the deposit's not paid, there's a 12%, right on that, because the deposit's not paid during due time.
Sorry, I'm just struggling a bit with that deposit, 12% deposit.
So let's just say the deposit's not paid, and it then defaults to a 12% increase on the deposit, or that in actual fact is an installment contract.
Yeah, so this is an instance where you're saying where the deposit's not paid and is forfeited, and then you want to apply default interest to it, which takes it up over the threshold. Well, look, I mean, the worst thing, it doesn't mean you lose entire contractual rights. What the Property Law Act does is it requires notice before termination. So if it happened to trigger, I'm not sure, the section in the Act, in the Property Law Act, talks about being required to pay amounts above these thresholds without entitlement to a conveyance, that sort of thing. So whether that default interest adds on to that and becomes part of it, I guess it could do. It doesn't mean, you know, it's not absolutely fatal to the seller's rights. It doesn't mean they don't have a right to call out the default. It may mean that if it takes them over a threshold, they have to give the notice provisions, give an opportunity, a bigger opportunity to remedy. So the policy under the Property Law Act was that, and it remains the long-standing, very long-standing provision, was that if buyers were required to sort of shell out large amounts for property but not be entitled to sort of a conveyance, then over these thresholds, then buyers, the sellers couldn't sort of capriciously terminate. They've got to give a notice to remedy, recognising, I guess, that a buyer has sort of put down more than a usual holding amount, and so should have a greater opportunity to remedy a default before losing the benefit of the contract. So I guess, you know, it's a very technical provision. So if it goes over the threshold, that default interest could do that. But I guess on the basis that under the Property Law Act, under the standard default interest rate's about 9-point-something% at the moment. I mean, if the seller acts promptly, maybe not huge amounts of interest are going to accrue before they try to exercise their rights, and that may not increase that greatly. But look, yeah, that's a technical point. So it just to be aware, if someone's got a great idea, let's get a bigger deposit here, you know, they're willing to pay a bigger deposit, that looks great from the seller's perspective. It just, there's a quid pro quo about that, but they may have to give a few more rights regarding, you know, regarding termination. So the default interest rate, I mean, commonly the space for this is left blank. So the Queensland Law Society publishes, I can't recall how often they update it, but it's quite readily available. Legal practitioners are well aware of it, and the area for the default interest is, I find, is commonly left blank. And yeah, at the moment it's 9.35%. So it will always be, you know, some kind of penalty rate, and that's obviously, you know, a good few percent above, you know, keen sort of lending rates at the moment, but it's not absolutely prohibitively high, like 18 or 20% or something. Oh yes, yes, yes. So the space is there. Can it be made higher? Absolutely. There's a space to nominate the amount. You can just put in a round figure, whatever it is. But if it's left blank, then it's just the floating default rate. And confident that it is left blank. So the settlement date. Obviously, this is a very key item, and again, chuck in a date. How hard can it be? But if it's by virtue of a formula. If there are any special conditions, it really should refer off to that. Don't try to duplicate if there are special conditions that talk about some deferred date or a formula or events which are going to give rise to the settlement date. Just refer in the item schedule, refer off those special conditions. If it's a firm date, it's a firm date, not a problem. It is obviously very important in time of the essence framework that's just thought about and doesn't become confusing. Item R, again, not usually a great deal of thought to give, but this is city or town for settlement. But this is kind of a matter of convenience for sellers largely. Question?
Sorry, just go back to item two there. Most of the contracts that flow through our office are sort of 30 days from contract date or 45 days from contract date. That says there that it only allows for a fixed date. Is that still illegal?
Oh, look, absolutely. And sorry, by fixed date, I mean, I sort of think that there's a sort of a line in terms of just completing the schedule. Yeah, no problem with 30 days from contract date, or, you can get a bit more fudgy with 14 days from finance approval or something like that, because, when does finance approval actually happen, and is from when they actually get approval, or is it from when they tell you they've got approval? So it's just being careful. There's basically one line, and I guess, in the reference schedule, you don't have room to have complex provisions about the settlement date if it's going to float. If it's going to be a floating date or a date by virtue of an event that's not very fixed. What you're looking for is just real certainty there because of the time of the essence obligations and the obvious consequences if it's not met by either party. So yeah, you've kind of got a line. It doesn't mean it's got to be a named date, but it's got to be a certain date, fixed in that manner, I guess, so that it be capable of being determined. And if you haven't got room in the reference schedule, it really needs to be dealt with in special conditions. So that city or town for completion, it's just to understand it's largely a seller's convenience thing, and it's going to be the default venue unless the parties agree otherwise. So if it's down the coast or if it's out at Toowoomba or something here in Brisbane, the seller's got the chance to sort of say where they want this to happen, and it's kind of for their convenience really, because it's the default otherwise. So obviously it's commonly CPD or something like that here in South East Queensland, but it's just to take that care, it's an opportunity for the seller to put that venue for their convenience. So items S, T, U and V for finance, these are obviously very long-standing sets in the reference schedule and pretty well understood. Just the clarity that's required is, are we in or are we out with finance approval? Just make sure you don't ever partially complete these or leave them. The note in the reference schedule is to make sure that they're struck through and initialed. I often find that's not done. It's often that if the finance clause isn't applicable, it'll just be pre-completed, not applicable, that kind of thing. So, it's not,